Do you enjoy creepy horror stories? Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spooky videos from Scare Street.
Feline Instinct by Justin Boote. Henry Thompson saw the semi-splattered remains of the crow by the roadside and grunted. Quickly looking around to ensure no one could see him, he removed a plastic bag, put on his gardening gloves, and scooped it up. It was just after the early morning rush hour, so Henry figured it was really lucky. He might find a few more. Shortly after rush hour was always the best time. With people speeding to get to work, more roadkill was likely to be found before the street cleaners came along. He grunted again and smiled when he saw a pigeon further ahead. This, too, was reasonably intact. He picked it up and left. People were starting to appear on the street, and he didn't want to be caught. Might not be good for business. He made sure to check the garbage cans on the way, though. As always, when he returned to his yard, the incessant meowing began. "Shut the fuck up and wait!" he cried. The cats ignored him and continued whining, making Henry seethe with annoyance and impatience. Why the hell he had gotten into this business, he didn't know. Damn ungrateful things, constantly whinging. Even fucking bit him if they got the chance, too. He often thought of leaving them to starve to death, giving them something to really complain about. But again, this would be bad for business. People generally didn't want to buy dead cats. When, in the safety of his office, he threw everything off the table, covered it with a plastic sheet, and emptied the bag. Then he grabbed a large knife from his drawer and chopped the dead birds into smaller pieces. After he finished, he dumped them in a bucket and headed outside to the shelter. The cats were going berserk by now, jumping and scrambling up the metal fence that made up the walls of their cage, jostling among themselves in anticipation. "There! Fucking choke on that!" he said, and spread the mutilated birds over as wide an area as he could. Dinner was served. Henry had been running the cat shelter for over 2 years now. It was the only way he could think of making money without spending too much to do so. After 3 years in prison for attempted robbery, his chances of finding meaningful employment were low. So, when a friend told him how he had a good little sideline catching stray dogs and getting paid for it, he had an idea. Cats were cheaper to maintain than dogs and usually sold better. And besides, he didn't have to take the damn things for a walk or clean up their mess. He spent the nights catching them over at the allotment where they usually gathered. Then he had the novel idea of how to save on feeding expenses. All in all, he didn't think he could complain too much. Although it seemed the cats didn't agree. Every time he entered the large cage, either to feed them or show a potential customer a specific animal, it was very rare he left without at least one good scratch down his arm or leg. Fucking things were savages, he often complained. Didn't appreciate anything. Weren't cats carnivores? Well, surely a bit of freshish meat was better than that biscuit crap everyone else fed them with. The problem was that they seemed to confuse dead crow or pigeon with his own flesh. More than one had ended up becoming dinner itself for the others. When the cats had finished eating, he switched the closed sign at the entrance to the yard to open, then returned to his office to read the newspaper. If anyone came, then a bell above the door would tinkle, announcing their arrival. He wasn't even halfway through the news when the bell told him he had a visitor. Hoping it wasn't an inspector, even though he had all the relevant licenses, or anyone who, God forbid, would like to know why he dedicated his mornings to collecting the daily roadkill, he rushed out to greet them. A teenager stood there. Carla. He had mixed feelings about Carla. On the one hand, she saved him money by coming regularly to bring them treats and toys or to just admire them. On the other, she was a bit of a pest. If she bought a cat or recommended them to friends, it might not be so bad. But if he wasn't careful, she might catch him one day feeding them his dubious concoctions. He didn't think she'd see things the way he did.
"Hi there, Mr. Thompson. I've brought a little snack for the cats."
"You know, you're gonna get 'em fat. Keep bringing 'em goodies. Who's gonna want to buy a fat cat?"
"They're not fat. Besides, they look like they could do with fattening up anyway. Look at them, practically fighting each other to get closer."
"Yeah, you watch," he thought. "One day they'll bite your fucking hand off. Let's see you bring 'em stuff then. Fucking savages." "All right, but be careful." He opened the door to their cage and let her in. As predicted, the cats did indeed go into a frenzy, meowing like crazy and climbing over each other to get the treats she'd brought. They hissed and snarled at one another like lions fighting over some dead carcass.
"Are you sure you're feeding them properly, Mr. Thompson? They look like they're starving."
"Nothing but the best, miss. Proper food for me cats. None of that biscuit stuff they sell at the supermarket. You watch your fingers now. And get the hell out of my yard if you're not buying." But it seemed Carla had no intention of leaving so soon. She squatted, stroked each one, murmuring nonsense to them. Henry was getting nervous. Their claws were like talons by now. He had a terrifying vision of the cats tearing her eyes out and having to call the police and an ambulance. He might be shut down. Then what was he to do? Eventually, Carla finished treating them like toddlers and left the cage. She only had one small scratch on her arm.
"Poor things. I'd love to buy one, but my mom won't let me. Anyway, gotta go. See you, Mr. Thompson,"
she said, and left. Henry shook his head and locked the cage again, cursing the young woman for testing his nerves. Just one bad scratch. That was all it would take. "Fucking savages," he spat, and returned to his office. A shot of something strong was required.
"Why don't we have a cat? I want a cat." "Carla, we are not having a cat in the house. I told you 1,000,000 times. They destroy the furniture." "But Mom, there are things for them to sharpen their claws. And Mr. Thompson has some real cute ones that need a home. I could use my allowance to pay for it." "No, you won't. Your allowance is to pay for your college education. And I've heard stories about Mr. Thompson. I don't like the guy. God knows what he feeds them. So no, forget it."
Carla sighed and gave up, knowing already she wouldn't win her over. She'd figured that if she got a part-time job, she could use the money to pay for its injections and license fee. But even that wouldn't convince her mother. Instead, she decided that on her 18th birthday, in a month, she'd just buy one anyway. If Mom didn't like it, she'd give it to her friend, Jackie. Jackie loved cats too. She had to admit, though, that Mr. Thompson didn't seem as friendly toward his cats as might have been expected. He looked at them as though they were vile, nasty monsters. This she couldn't understand. If he didn't like cats, why run a cat shelter? And on several occasions, she'd been to the yard and seen large feathers in their cage. She didn't want to know how they might have gotten there, although she had an idea. Mr. Thompson had a reputation for being tight with money, and the state of his yard was a good example of it. His office from the outside looked like it was about to crumble around him at any moment, and he could certainly do with buying himself new clothes once a year, at least. This was partly the reason she liked to visit so often. She had the idea the cats were always so manic when she arrived with treats because they were half-starved to death. The next time she paid a visit, she'd start looking at the cats more closely. It was time to make a tough decision. Which one of the 7 there would become her new pet? Armed with a bag full of roadkill again, Henry returned to the shelter and went through the process of dismembering. He was in a bad mood today. He hadn't sold a single damn cat all week. Usually, on a good week, he could expect to sell 4 or 5 at least, which provided just enough to pay his bills and any vices he might have. Now, though, he didn't even have the money to replace the empty bottle of whiskey in his office. He cursed and swore while he prepared the cat's food, mumbling about life, the world, and how unfair it all was. "Next time, I ought to come back as a fucking cat. Little shits get fed, taken to good homes, do what they want, catch mice for fun." He filled the bucket with the cat's dinner and headed over to their cage. As always, they screeched, howled, and hissed at one another when they caught the scent of food. "Shut the fuck up," he growled. "Should let you starve, miserable little fuckers. Why do you have to have it so good when I can't even afford a damn drink?" He threw open the cage and emptied the bucket. One of the cats scratched his arm in its attempt to get at the morsels. "Ouch, you little fucker!" He pushed it hard, only for it to return immediately, hissing. Another inadvertently scratched him as it fought to grab food. Blood ran down both arms. He cursed again, deciding it was best to make a hasty retreat before he was either attacked or his anger got the better of him and he single-handedly ruined his business enterprise. As he crouched to get through the door, the first cat that had scratched him launched itself at his neck and bit him. Another, perhaps attracted by the smell of blood, clawed his face, leaving long, deep scratches across his cheek. Others bit at his ankles as though in a feeding frenzy. Henry screamed, flailing wildly at the animals as he desperately sought to escape. He was already thinking of poisoning them before he made it to safety. Once outside, he slammed the door shut and locked it. His shirt and trousers were torn, splattered in his own blood. And when he looked back at the cats, they were still trying to get at him through the wire mesh. "That's it! You fucking had it now!" He stood up again quickly with the firm intention of grabbing a bottle of rat poison he kept in his office when he slipped and smashed his head on the concrete floor. It was a long time before he regained consciousness.
"Mr. Thompson?"
called Carla again.
"Strange,"
she thought. Even though it was the evening, the yard was open. But after ringing the bell several times, he was nowhere to be seen. Usually he came straight away, sometimes with a grin on his face when he thought it was a possible customer, other times scowling. But he always came straight away. She knew the rumors about him and that he had spent some time in prison, but Carla thought that one shouldn't be punished for the rest of one's life just because a mistake had been made. He'd been to prison, done his time. That was that. She was still young, but already knew that life could be hard and unfair. Her father had been out of work for 4 years. Desperate times sometimes called for desperate measures, and by taking in stray cats, he was returning his debt to society. They were left to fend for themselves, and many did indeed starve to death. She called his name again, saw no sign of him around the yard, and assumed he was in his office. The door was open. This was also strange. Mr. Thompson never left the door open. She didn't know what was inside. She suspected very little, but he seemed highly protective of the place, only letting people in to sign the forms when they bought a cat. She'd been coming here for months now, and he'd never offered to let her in, even when it started raining. Carla looked around, feeling a little nervous. Things weren't right. Something might have happened to him. She thought he looked due a heart attack, overweight, red veins snaking across his nose and cheeks as though he had a permanent cold, although she guessed the smell of whiskey on his breath each day might be the real cause. She knocked on the door, heard nothing, so she stepped in. As she suspected, the place looked as though it hadn't seen a broom in months, years even. Dust clung to everything like wet sand. Cobwebs hung in every corner, and the empty glass on his desk contained enough dead flies to keep the owners of the spider webs fed for months. It had been 2 days since she last saw him, yet even if he had been away, she thought his office might look like this permanently, regardless. She opened one of the drawers to his desk. Inside, as she thought there might be, sat an empty bottle of whiskey and other smaller bottles. She pulled one out and looked at the label. Haloperidol, it read. Another bottle had the same name on it. She put them back quickly, planning to Google the name later and discover their purpose. The idea that something had happened to him, and, consequently, and more importantly, that the cats might have been left unattended, also made her more nervous than ever. She was just about to check on them when she glanced at a bucket by the door. Carla jumped back in disgust. It was filled with feathers, mainly black and gray, and birds' feet. A pair of eyes looked up at her, crow's eyes sitting in its head. She knew now with certainty that the rumors about how he fed the cats were true. The unscrupulous, disgusting old guy didn't even bother to empty the bucket each day. No wonder he didn't want people coming in. She felt ill. To think the poor cats were being fed dead birds and rodents scraped from the road made her want to gag, punch him, make him eat them. More importantly, instead of buying just one cat next week, she would buy them all. Carla quickly left the office and headed straight to the cage. She thought of opening the door and releasing them all, but, funnily, and one that saddened her more than anything else, she knew deep down that dead bird was still better than nothing. She knew of people who hated cats and put out poison for them in the allotment where they hunted. As always, she smelled and heard the cats before seeing them, although this time it was dark, and the only light offered to her was by the full moon directly above and what seeped through from the street lamps outside. Several litter trays were at the back of the cage, filled with soil, and Carla had wondered many times how often he cleaned them. Sometimes the smell made her eyes water. She was relieved to see the cats were all okay, or as well as they might be if Mr. Thompson had left for whatever reason, or had an accident. No animals lying dead or dying from starvation or dehydration, and just as manic and excited as usual.
Hey,
she said as she squatted beside the door, poking her fingers through to stroke them.
How long you been without food, huh?
The cats answered in their unique language, their incessant meowing telling Carla it might have been a while. Then she noticed the large mounds where their litter trays were.
If they haven't been fed,
she thought,
it certainly wasn't showing when they did their business.
She smiled, happy they were okay until her smile faltered. The floor was littered with feathers and innards. Blood was splattered everywhere, as though a titanic battle had taken place, and the birds obviously lost. This, too, was unusual. She knew now how Mr. Thompson fed his cats, but he was usually careful to ensure there was no evidence of that. So what had happened to him, and who had fed them then? A shadow moved in the far corner. She hadn't noticed at first. Her main concern had been that the cats were alive and okay, but now whatever she was seeing disturbed her immensely. Then it turned to face her, or rather, he did. Mr. Thompson looked at her, squatting on all fours, a strange growling sound coming from him. Sitting in his mouth sat the remains of a pigeon, its intestines dangling and swinging against Mr. Thompson's chin like worms. Instinctively, Carla jolted, almost falling to the floor in shock.
Mr. Thompson? Are you okay? What are you doing?
The growling grew in intensity, becoming a long, hissed shriek. His eyes were gleaming and wide, his clothes filthy and torn in many places, smears of blood on his shirt. The bird dropped to the floor, and he immediately placed a protective hand over it, as though it might escape. He took a step forward.
Mr. Thompson? You're scaring me. Why are you in there?
The grin on his face was not a pleasant one. His teeth were showing, and even from the scarce light as he slowly approached, she could see smears of blood and feathers on them. But it was his eyes that scared her the most. They had an almost mischievous intensity to them, as though he was about to do something he shouldn't and didn't care for the consequences. like a small child who has just been naughty and gotten away with it. Mr. Thompson edged closer to her, the cats keeping a wide berth of him. Carla took another step back, quickly looking behind her and calculating how fast she could get away and in which direction to run. Then she saw the gate to the cage was open. Mr. Thompson was almost within striking distance now.
Mr. Thompson, please, stop!
Instead, he launched himself at her, clanging against the cage's fence, completely missing the door in his frenzy. Carla didn't wait. She bolted, screaming, from the yard. What you're telling me is indeed strange. You're saying he was acting like one of his cats, including a dead pigeon in his mouth? Carla simply nodded. She still couldn't quite believe she was here telling this guy, or that she hadn't imagined or dreamt it. Strange sounded rather mild. Downright terrifying might have been a better turn of phrase. Well, there is a disorder that might explain it, but it is extremely rare. Only 65 cases have ever been recorded. Before I jump to conclusions, though, is there anything else you can tell me about what happened? Carla looked at the psychiatrist, Matthew, relieved. At first, she had assumed he wouldn't believe her, that it was some kind of joke or prank, perhaps planned by her mother, the psychiatrist's friend. 2 days had passed since she ran from Mr. Thompson, yet the memory was as if it had happened an hour ago. She thought she'd never rid her mind of him staring at her with a mutilated pigeon in his mouth. Then she remembered the pills she'd seen in his office.
When I was in his office looking for him, I saw these pills in a drawer. I'd never heard of the name before. I was going to Google it, see what they were.
And can you remember the name on the label now?
Haloperidol or something?
Haloperidol?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Know what it is?
Haloperidol is a strong antipsychotic drug used for disorders such as schizophrenia. This may explain a little, but not what suddenly triggered it.
Triggered what?
There is a disorder called zoanthropy. It is when people believe themselves to be and act like non-human animals. There have been cases of those who acted like cats, dogs, even a horse in one case. Carla didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She stared at Matthew, gobsmacked, and wondered if the prank was now being played on her. Believe themselves to be a cat? A horse? What did they do? Run around on all fours, eating hay and making ridiculous noises? But then the image of the pigeon in his mouth returned. Also the large mounds where the cat litter tray was. She shuddered, guessing what those mounds now represented. Carla?
Huh? Oh, sorry. I was thinking. This is real, right? This disorder? People believe themselves to be animals?
You said he had a dead pigeon in his mouth, didn't you? What might have triggered this?
I don't know. He seemed fine the last time I saw him. Maybe he forgot to take his pills. The bottle was empty when I looked.
The psychiatrist was silent for a moment, thinking. Carla, where is he now? When was the last time you saw him?
3 days ago? I haven't been back since. He scared me.
And then the realization hit her. If he was ill and no one had been to the yard for 3 days, he might be in serious trouble. He could be anywhere. She shuddered again. She had a vision of him running around at night, chasing mice. And the poor cats. They could have gone 3 days now without food or water. Unless she knew cats had a mean streak to them, were quite cruel, loving to chase and catch birds that were almost bigger than they were. What if Mr. Thompson was chasing things at night, bigger than mice or birds? Other people, for example. The look of horror on Carla's face was now evidently understood perfectly by Matthew. I think we need to find him. Straight away. Carla nodded. When they arrived at the cat shelter, the yard door was slightly ajar. Carla was terrified, unsure of what to expect. In her worst-case scenario, she imagined all the cats dead, eaten, or attacked by Mr. Thompson, and maybe a few human corpses strewn around as well. Maybe he wasn't even here. Someone seeing him run around at night or during the day could have called for help, but the psychiatrist had phoned around the various hospitals, including Northgate Hospital for the mentally impaired, and no one knew anything. They had to assume then that he was inside. If he has indeed taken on the guise of a cat, I would imagine he sleeps during the day. If so, I'll sedate him, then call for him to be collected. But we need to confirm first. If he's awake, according to his state of mind and level of danger he might present, I'll call straight away. He could be dangerous, Carla.
Okay,
She replied and stepped into the yard, not daring to make a sound. She pointed to where his office was and the animal's cage at the far end of the yard. Mr. Thompson was nowhere to be seen. As they edged closer, Carla kept looking back at the yard door, seeing it get further away and wondering if she'd be quick enough to get through it should he charge. The idea of him bounding after them on all fours almost provoked a chuckle. So absurd was the image in her head. But then she thought about what he might do to her, and that stifled any giggling immediately. "Okay, let's check the cat's cage first," said Matthew. "Make sure the real cats are all right." As they approached, they could hear a droning, buzzing sound, as though Mr. Thompson had decided to install an electric pylon in his yard. Most of the cats were asleep, strewn out across the floor, while others paced up and down. Carla relaxed slightly when she saw that at least the cats were safe, but that soon turned to unease, then horror. The floor to their cage was littered with mutilated birds. Such was the number of dead creatures, it was almost impossible to see the concrete underneath. Pools of sticky dried blood covered it. Even some of the cats had it on their fur. Multiple pigeon and crow heads lay everywhere, making it look as though Mr. Thompson had engineered new balls for them to play with. Intestines hung from the fence, dangling as if the remains of desperate escapees. The whole area looked as though someone had collected all the roadkill from the nearby roads and dumped them here, perhaps collaborating with Mr. Thompson in an enterprising way. Then one of the cats kicked a pigeon's head, and the reason behind the buzzing was discovered. An army of flies rose angrily into the air, turning the sky black. They swarmed for a while, then resumed feeding and laying their eggs. Maggots were already squirming, which some of the cats took to be playthings. "Jesus Christ," muttered Matthew. Carla glanced at him. He looked as pale as she felt. "It looks like an abattoir in here. And all this in just 3 days?" Carla noticed his Adam's apple was bobbing up and down frantically, as though he was having trouble swallowing. She was too. "Okay, well, he's not in there. Let's check his office." Carla followed behind him, wondering what would happen to the cats once Mr. Thompson was taken away. Surely they now had the taste for blood. No tin of whiskers was going to satisfy these creatures. They stopped outside his office. No sound came from inside, which they both agreed to be a good sign. Hopefully, he was in there asleep. Carla didn't want to end up like the birds back there, which, considering the slaughter that had taken place, seemed a very real possibility. "Okay, Carla, I'm going to go inside first. If you hear me shout 'run,' you do so and phone the police. Got it?" She nodded, her mouth and lips too dry for her to articulate any answer vocally. When the psychiatrist entered the office, she braced herself to run, expecting at any moment for him to scream in agony or burst out the door. But nothing happened for what seemed like ages, until a loud thud and crash like the sound of furniture being thrown across the office startled her. She gasped and jerked again when another great thud made the door rattle. Then there was silence. She thought of going in to check, calling to him, or simply running. But how could she run without knowing what was going on in there?
Damn it,
she muttered, opening the door and peering in. Mr. Thompson's chair was lying on its side, the desk thrown against the far wall. She turned around immediately, intent on running, when she glanced to her left and saw Matthew lying on the floor. She screamed. His head was twisted back so far it looked like he was trying to study his spine. Great gashes ran across his cheek, the seeping blood already joining the large pool forming on the floor from where his throat had been torn open. Carla stepped back, her legs unstable, and tripped over a fallen book, landing heavily on her backside. She tried to push herself up again, yet her legs had lost all will to function normally, feeble and useless as they were now. She looked wildly around for Mr. Thompson, but he was nowhere to be seen. Then she heard a faint sound coming from underneath the toppled desk. It sounded like harsh chuckling, or was it growling? She tried to push herself to her feet again, yet kept slipping on the paperwork strewn around the place. A bloodied hand came into view, then an arm, followed by the rest of the body. Carla tried to scream, but her vocal cords had now frozen. Mr. Thompson's head appeared from behind the desk, and this time Carla did manage to articulate a long, desperate scream. His face was covered in blood, running down his chin and splashing onto his torn, filthy shirt. A wide grin showed bloodied teeth, a madman's grin, inhuman. His eyes were huge and gleaming, fixed on Carla, bulging unnaturally. Then what finally gave her the strength to jump up and run for the door was when his back began to arch and swing from side to side. He was getting ready to pounce, just as a cat would when it was about to attack some poor creature, and which she'd always found so comical. She bolted for the door, screaming for help. Carla made it outside and almost reached the yard door in safety when she was thrown to the ground. She tried to rise again, yet something had a hold of her foot and was dragging her back.
Mr. Thompson, please, it's me, don't!
But the expression on his face told her there was no way he would listen. He was playing a game, just as cats loved to torment their victims before killing them. So was he playing with her now. With her free leg, she lashed out at him, kicking him hard in the head, but all she achieved was only for the low whine coming from him to change to a hissing growl. She kicked once more, this time managing to free herself from him. She jumped up and ran toward the door, almost safe, but expecting his hand to grab her again at any second. And it did. Carla fell, and this time Mr. Thompson sat on her, one hand clamped across her throat.
Please, let me help you. You're not well. It's me. You remember me?
And it seemed he did, for his grin widened to impossible proportions, showing his teeth, his eyes wild with mischievous joy as his face edged ever closer to hers. The last thing that crossed Carla's mind, before his teeth found her throat, was how Mr. Thompson himself had once told her he respected cats for their ruthlessness, but only when they weren't hungry, of course. The psychiatrist's blood on his face answered all her questions as to whether Mr. Thompson might still be hungry.
Are you looking for more creepy horror stories? Click the link in the description or search Scare Street on Audible for a list of all our bone-chilling titles. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more spooky videos from Scare Street. See you in the shadows.